Thank you.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
for having us.
Great. All right. So the next talk we're going to quickly jump right into is with Pedram and Jay, and we're going to be talking about deepfakes in speech. Which again, when I think about these issues, just as these guys come up, and I think Adam will promote them to speakers in just a moment. I think is one of the most important angles to this, because again, one of the biggest challenges we face is knowing who's a real person and what's really speaking versus not, and then the new technical capabilities in theory. When we talk about the difference between public and private spaces, where historically, if you wanted to speak, you spoke in your voice, and you only had so many hours in the day. So you couldn't have an infinite number of private conversations at the same time. The world we're moving into with good deep fakes, in theory, I can have an infinite number of conversations in parallel that feel personal or are, in theory, private conversations, but actually are multiplexed to be at the same scale as any public forum. So I see Pedram, you're up. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
And I can't, let me just scroll the screen. Are you there? Jay, you're there as well. Excellent. Nice to see you both.
How are you?
I'm still learning how to navigate Zoom 6 months in. So guys, thanks for joining. Do you guys want to briefly introduce your backgrounds a little bit? I think that would be helpful to kind of level set the conversation we're about to have. Pedram, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Pedram. I worked at Facebook for about 7 years. The first 5.5 years of that, I worked on anti-spam technologies, so protecting people's accounts from being hacked, spam, pornography, 419 scams, and generally keeping people safe. And we experienced technology go from very rudimentary attacks to very sophisticated attacks, and build a lot of machine learning and pipelines to combat those attacks, and work with policymakers and ops throughout the company. So it's been a good time of my life hitting my head against the spam wall.
Fair enough.
Hi, I'm Jay Costa, and I'm the executive director of a group called Voters' Right to Know. We are a nonprofit that works to advance transparency of the money being spent in the context of election campaigns. And I've been working on the problem of campaign finance and money in politics for about a decade now. I've done so in the context of investigative journalism, data journalism at groups like MapLight. I've also done so in the context of advocacy and policy work, including, at Voters' Right to Know, my current organization. So that the democracy angle is very much, where I'm coming from on this question, and we'll get more deeply into that.
Excellent. So let me just start out by saying it's like, with no legal regimes in place, purely based on a technological, if you took a purely technological perspective, how many years out do you guys ballpark think we are from a world in which it'll be very hard for the average consumer to distinguish between having, hearing a message or a post from a real person versus a great deep fake bot? Is that now? Is that 3 years from now? Is that 10 years from now? And how do you think about kind of that line?
And when you think of a deepfake bot, are you thinking something that was premeditated by an individual, like a script that they wrote, or you're talking about completely auto-generated, personalized messages?
Let's start with like it was intentional and pre-scripted, and then we'll get into the generative. Let's put it that way.
If you look at what we have right now, you can already fake a great number of people with some technical sophistication. I actually spent some time yesterday talking to the head of Facebook's red team, that machine learning red team. They already see threats like this right now, but it still requires specialized machines and a lot of processing time to get there. I think that we're 2 to 3 years from those things being available from anyone, being able to use their mobile phone attached to some back-end service where you can pick anyone's image or voice that you want, whether it's a public figure or someone that you know, replicate it and get them to say whatever you want, with the ability to fool quite a number of people.
Yeah.
So not very far away.
I would agree, and I would actually say that, to be honest, it feels almost like an unnecessary distinction to be drawing that it needs to come from bots or be the process of any kind of automated and in a sophisticated way development process. The bottom line is that we are already very much in a place where there's a huge amount of content that is not credible and in fact is manipulated intentionally to deceive users. And I think we're rapidly getting to the place where that is looking like, people saying things that they don't say. But, from the perspective of people being exposed to content that they can't really decide if it's true or false, or whether to believe it or let it influence their decision making, we're already there.
Well, I guess the question for me, and then maybe you guys can think about this, is like, look, in the end of the day, whether it's a fully generative system versus like some sort of scripted system versus just frankly brute forcing it, we can say I can create deep fakes right now with 1,000 people, and like it really is about like a sophistication and cost hurdle to creating fake reality, right? It used to be maybe a cost, just make up numbers, it cost $1 million to create a fake reality, 10 years ago. Now it costs $100,000. The cost curve on that, with Moore's law and better technology just comes down. So I guess the question I would ask is like, we've clearly already been through the beginnings of this, where with enough money and effort, you can create a pretty credible fake version of reality. As the curve comes down and creating fake realities becomes cheaper and more accessible to more actors, what's going to happen? Like, where are we going to end up? Any sort of like limitations being placed on that and enforcing.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things here. One is the costs are going to go down. At the same time, between all the filters that we're training ourselves to see a different version of reality with filters and the generated bunny ears and things like that. So people are becoming desensitized to what is real to begin with. I think the set of threats that we see right now is state actors or people with deep pockets being able to manipulate what a elected official would say and generate hysteria or perceptions of a group of people. As the cost goes down and down and down, it's going to be your cousin Ronnie who's going to make a spoof of the current president saying something, and your aunt making another spoof. And I think the place where it gets challenging isn't so much that we can't distinguish fake from real, it's that the policies aren't going to be able to discern what can a platform take off, what is acceptable fakeness and what is unacceptable fakeness. I think that becomes the real challenge, not the technology or the cost challenge. It's literally what is an acceptable fake.
Yeah. And I guess the question, maybe Jay, I'll ask you this, is like, to me, it seems like there are two big problems with this. One big problem is the issue of people not knowing, like explicitly false messages being put out there, right? And so like, and like the actual damage of those. The second is like the lack of trust in reality, right? Where it's like, if you see enough fake things, you think everything is fake. How do you guys weigh, or Jay, maybe I'll start with you, like how do you weigh those two different components, or is there a different vector that I'm not even thinking about the cost of deep fakes in speech and how these things play out?
I think there actually is one middle case that is also really problematic, which is as the trust in reality diminishes among the public and the prevalence of deep fakes increases, there's the ability of those in power to actually hide their real actions by blaming them on, oh, that was just a doctored video, that was a deep fake, don't worry about it. That, sending the military in to break up that protest that someone made, that, police shooting a black person, that was just a fake video. So that, I think that's another real danger. To me, the solution though is, you could talk. First of all, I don't necessarily accept the premise that it's inevitable that we have to get to the place where we have this ambiguous coexistence of real and fake content. I think that just as, the cost curve is going to go in a certain direction, surrounding the ability to make these videos, there's no reason why technology can't similarly advance in the ability to detect fake videos. And I think just tagging real versus fake content, or content that has been bears characteristics of being edited or created in a certain way, could be a really important sort of heuristic to give people as they're consuming content online. But I also just think that the more information that we can give people in general, from a sort of a marketplace of ideas perspective, this is going to be what allows for the most intelligent and rational consumption of information. And for me, and voters' right to know, one of those pieces of information is the source of content, particularly if it's paid content. Let's make sure that we know who that is really coming from. And, Sam, as you said in the previous conversation, that should be a real entity, not some, like online handle. So that's another angle that I would give to sort of what might help the problem.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
I just want to add to that is that I think, Sam, you quoted something Elliot said last year is, everyone has freedom of speech. It's freedom after speech that really matters. And that speaks to reputation and consequences of what you say. And so to what Jay's point is that these, deep fakes, any kind of content, it really matters because these pieces of information spread on different platforms, Twitter and Facebook. And these platforms, I think, have a responsibility to actually start to surface the reputation and the trust of the originating source of that content.
Yeah.
And right now you can see someone can create an account. They can, through any number of mechanisms, create a video that will spread to millions of people in no time. Millions of people now have their perception changed. That account goes away, but the perception is still there. And I think that in the race to get more engagement and more accounts on these services, there's been this lack of thought around, okay, well, now that we have billions of people, how do we actually surface something that's uncomfortable, which is their trust and the reputation score, and make that visible to all the people that they interact with and all the content that they post and repost?
Well, yeah, and Pedram, as you and I talked about before, and I've written about before, like there is some irony to the fact that if you go back to the founding of Facebook was actually very much built on this premise, right? Like that, this is a period where like the internet was untrusted and unwashed, and people were scared of it with real names and real identity and real conversation. And Facebook created an enclave, based on university ID and then bidirectional friendships, which was heavily built to create trust in reality and real identities and how information was passed around. And so I think harkening back to those original concepts, I think is probably, we'll talk about this also in the next panel, like, clear senses of identity are important, right? And probably are the only system level solve, right? Because you're not gonna, you can have the race and the game a whack-a-mole on trying to detect these, but in the end of the day, it's like speaking with an identity that has a reputation and can lose reputation, and trust seems to be the only economic way to wrap this. But I do wonder, first I'm happy to hear your reactions to that, but I'd also just wonder how you guys think about, again, we go back to the government, we talked about the last panel a little bit, which is the government's responsibility versus platform's responsibility to think about this content, right? And think about, effectively setting rules around it, and or moderating it, because it's gonna exist, right? The question is only, what the laws are and what the enforcement is, from that perspective.
Absolutely. Jay may be able to speak to this a little bit more. The only thing I would throw in there is that I don't think the government should be in a position where they're setting how to regulate and what should be taken down or up. But just like they do with dietary nutrition information on food that you consume in your body, there needs to be some kind of framework for what is surfaced to users about what are they about to consume in their mind.
Yep.
Like, what level of modification has been made to this video? Where was the source of it? And the platforms, I think, are responsible for implementing that on every piece of content.
So should the platform? Sorry, go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to agree completely, and I think that analogy is a really good one, because the bottom line is when you look at how people behave really across all domains, we're not rational consumers. We are drawn to the things that are more tickle the different parts of our brains in certain ways. And so I think it's important to counterbalance those tendencies as consumers with information about certain things that we should be taking into account that are more relevant to our long-term interests and not just driven by sort of entertainment level incentivization and values.
Yeah, the nutritional facts direction and disclosure is obviously something I feel very good about and native to me, which is say what you want, but say it in an authentic voice. And platforms move potentially out of the business of taking things down to more just like disclosing facts about them, right? But Jay, I guess to your point, there is this question where, well, I'll give you my favorite analogy, which is the invention of gin in England. where when gin was invented, the entire English population was drunk for about 100 years. It was like the GDP went down. It was ridiculous. People recovered out of it because they, to a certain extent. I guess the question in my mind is like, as a societal level, we just have to go through the process of learning not to trust information with bad nutritional facts. Is that just a gestation period, or do we have to take a more active role because of the potential damage that can be done in the short term?
I think we have to take a more active role because, I mean, I think if you look at, that's an interesting example. But I think that there are a lot of other examples, by that same logic, is something like, payday lending or, the deregulation of firearms, is the first case going to make us better more financially literate by just like letting that kind of run its course? Letting consumers take, loans with bad terms? Probably not. It's probably going to drive people into, deeper debt. Deregulate.
There is an interesting history there, right? Which is that there was, for most of American history, there was actually at a government level, like people like thought scams were good because they taught consumers to be responsible and defensive, right? There's this whole philosophy of like allowing things like scams at a societal level to create more resilience in the pot. I'm not saying that's obviously not in vogue these days or necessarily even right, but it is interesting that kind of perspective is a modern one. It's not necessarily historically the norm.
Sounds like it could be the basis of another conversation, because I think that there's a lot to take up there. I mean, I think all you have to do is look at, recent market activity to question the logic of that one. But I feel like in my view, the place to start in terms of intervening really is in the sphere of elections. This is where, like, to me, this is some of the most critical content from a public interest point of view. In terms of people making, deep fakes of their cats or their, best friends or whatever. I mean, you can think of problems actually in the just purely social context in terms of, reputational harm, bullying, whatever. But in terms of what would give the most grounds for government regulation, I think it's like interfering in elections, because I think there's a lot of danger in the ability of this content to influence the outcome of elections if it's not, put in its proper context.
So what do you do about that? I mean, Pedram, do you just say if you are running for elected office, it's illegal to make and distribute deepfake content of any potential candidate or elected official?
Yeah, but in that world, like, if you check out Bad Lip Reading, they have these great clips of the NFL and they have the State of the Union. Like, is that a deep fake? They took, an existing video and they overlaid someone else's voice saying different things to it. What is satire? What is the intent of that video? And I think that's where the policy gets really challenging. I don't think there's like a silver bullet here. I think that, again, the proliferation of making these videos very easily and very cheaply means that they're going to come at a rate that we just can't even imagine. The detection is going to be slow. The policies are going to lag what's actually happening, and the operations people are not going to be able to capture things. So you could ban it altogether. You can put very simple rules in place at the platform level that says anything of the likeness of these 500 people running in any elections in these states, in these countries, just can't even appear on these platforms. But that's not even realistic. I think, yeah, I'm kind of at a loss for what is the right next step for this.
Well, I think, in my view, it's like, it's not about saying that they can't appear as much as it is just applying the most stringent disclosure requirements around those videos that bear likeness of candidates. And, if there's one thing that these platforms have gotten really good at, it's at, tagging people automatically. There's absolutely no reason why every single candidate, at basically every level of American government, they have to declare why that there couldn't be a library of their images that is used to apply a different set of standards to the videos that are bearing their likeness during the context of an election. In campaign finance, we have electioneering windows. It's like 45 days before a primary and 90 days before a general. Certain speech rules go into effect that weren't previously there. And I think that there's no reason why those can't apply here.
I mean, Jay, I've been to the challenge, but I'm curious how you'd react to this. I mean, someone makes a really good point in the comments, which is like 95% of the current deep fakes out there, maybe not the most worrisome one from like a global civilization level, but certainly from a personal harm level, is just like porn deep fakes, right? Where people like put a different face on porn or things like that. Like, is there a world, would you support a world where you're just like, look, if you choose to click a button, you can just like block your face from being used, like, you know, or just content on a platform with your face on it, period, or something that looks like your face? Like,
would I personally do that?
No, I'm not saying personally. Like, would you, like, you're talking about an election window for specific officials. Like, what about a world? And I'm not saying I support this. I'm just kind of curious how you guys react to it. Where you're just like, yeah, like, look, deep fakes, you're not going to stop them from being created, but like the platforms, or even at a national level, there's a national face registry, which is kind of ironic in a lot of ways. You say like, look, if you upload, you know, these facial prints, you can just stop digital communication from including.
Yeah, but that again, I mean, deep fakes is not just video, it's also audio. And actually, more recent research, you can, with about 15 seconds of someone's voice, reproduce their voice pretty well. So I think that if we're to think about general solutions for this, it really goes back to the trust of the creator and the velocity at which that content can spread. Yeah. And in the world where you can affect the decision-making and a perception of millions and tens of millions of people in a few short hours, you know, the algorithms that generate the news feeds and distribution should have rules in place to like really clamp down on those things, not restrict it. If I want to share something, I should be able to share it. But Facebook and Twitter should repost or republish that based on how trustworthy am I, how new is this content, how likely is it to be fake, and just like really clamp down on that. I mean, I think that's really the direction that is cleanest here, is thinking about
the identity base. I mean, I 100% agree with that. And I also, personally, I'll put on the cards that, like, for me, allowing consumers to have encryption, for instance, as a technology and communicate with each other securely is critical and doesn't mesh with any sort of limitations on sharing, on what you can share. You know, so it has to be a reputational based solution. But it is going to be an interesting and I think different world where we have to learn to not trust our senses, right? It seems like kind of the net of a lot of these types of things. So guys, we're almost out of time. I really appreciate you both joining for this conversation. Anything you guys want to end with in terms of where we're heading from a deepfake perspective and how it'll change how we have to think about speech and the regulation of it?
The one thing I would put it there is you said, like, do we have to basically let this gestate in our society and see where it goes, or do we take an active role? I think actually we have to take a very active role, because you think about the next generation of voters are, you know, they're in their teens and before that right now, and they're being trained to see an altered version of reality and be fine with that. And I think that education at that age is really what's going to matter for the problems that we're going to face 5, 10, 20 years from now, not necessarily art or my generation.
I completely agree with that. And I think also to take a really active role in the context of, you know, the current election. You know, I think that the fact that, you know, it wasn't until after 2016 that we started to look at, you know, the fallout of, you know, Cambridge Analytica and, you know, the mass, the manipulation of, you know, data at mass scale, that we started to really have a debate about it. And I think, you know, we've already started to see this problem, you know, rear its head. I would not be at all surprised if it's going to become more relevant in the context of 2020. And I think it's something that we have to be, you know, on like a dog on a bone. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves in the same position that we were post 2016.
Fair enough. Gentlemen, I really appreciate you joining for this conversation. And I will obviously be continuing it. It's a big one.